for me, I think this meme sums it up really, really well. I don't know how many of you have seen this before, but yeah, I found it kind of amusing. There's been this explosion in remote working. Zoom went from being this niche tool to a household name, and it's kind of rapidly on the way to becoming a generic. It's so well known. It's going to be like the Hoover of webinars, I suspect. And we saw Microsoft Teams go from, again, being a reasonably slow adoption. It had 20 million users at the end of 2019. By the end of March, it had 44 million users, and by the end of April, it had 75 million users. So we're seeing fundamental shift in the way that we're working. And without these and other tools, we wouldn't have coped, and we wouldn't have been able to have the same response that we have. And yet we've still got a lot of work to do. So the question of this particular session is, what if we can't solve this? And the answer is we can't. Should we go to the pub? Oh yeah, okay. Had better explore what we can do then, I suppose. I also want to say IT has a really vital role in what we can do. Without the existing tech platforms, 2020 would have been even harder. And we have a role in both engaging with and resolving the problems that we currently have and preparing ourselves for future things. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we respond to the unexpected when it meets us, how to be better prepared next time, and how we can really do good for ourselves and for others in an unpredictable world. I'd like to explore with you the kind of, what other unprecedented events we've gone through in the last few years. I don't think I'm going to ask this question. That was going to be a general question to kind of get people going. As technology limitations, have a think about the other unexpected events. Some of the ones that popped out for me were Brexit, the Icelandic volcano. I don't know if anyone does have any and you want to share them in the chat right now, please do. If anyone's like, completely unexpected events that caught us all by surprise. Okay, I'm going with this question caught everyone by surprise, and so there aren't any answers. We'll move on. So, in his book Accession, Ian Banks describes a situation that happens to the culture, and the culture is this incredible post-scarcity, post-illness, faster than light travel, incredibly advanced society with hugely advanced AI. And in this story, what happens is an alien craft just pops into existence. They have no idea what to do about it, despite being so advanced. And everything they do seems to make it worse. It responds really strangely. It kind of blows things up and just causes all sorts of problems. And in this book, Ian Banks coins the term an outside context problem. And he sums this kind of thing up rather well. He says, outside context problems are the things that most civilizations would encounter just once, and which they tended to encounter in rather the same way that a sentence encountered a full stop. And these disruptive events that we've experienced, you can kind of see them as potentially outside context problems. They're what happens when we don't have a model for what's happening. We don't have any way of grasping it. So we don't know what we can do. We don't know what's going to make things better, what's going to make things worse. Our assumptions are just plain wrong and stop working for us. And perhaps they are so wrong that this represents an existential threat. What we can often do when we encounter something that we truly don't understand is just leave it alone. Stop poking the thing that we don't understand. Run away. But sometimes we can't do that. The thing approaches us, and that's a fundamentally different problem. So sometimes we encounter problems that arise from our existing context, that emerge. They're not just there, they come at us. And the problem with these problems and working with these problems is if we stop doing what caused them, a whole load of other things stop happening as well. In the context of COVID happening, that was brought about by free travel and a whole load of other really important things that we rely upon. And so we could temporarily stop that and free that, but we really suffer when that happens, and all of the knock-on positives go away as well. The problem is everything is all tangled up, and when you pull on one thread, you kind of get a whole load of other stuff with it. And this is the essence of disruption. This is why it's such a difficult problem to work with. You get these knock-on problems. Everything is interdependent, and we don't even know the interdependence, the working of the system as we encounter it, particularly when it relates to these kind of new problems. So we can't address it in a conventional way. A lot of the rules don't work, and a lot of the approaches don't work. We have to fundamentally change our relationship and shift the way we think about the problem before we can actively work on a solution. And I'm going to talk about how. So when we find ourselves in this position, we find ourselves in this sudden chaotic not knowing, there are three really common responses to this. The first one is freeze. Stop. Just don't do anything. Just hope it's going to get back to normal. Hope the monster's going to wander away and leave me alone. It does cost time. We lose time in this and we become passive, but there is a possibility it might just go away. That does kind of work. The second approach is trial and error, random thrashing about, doing everything possible. This costs resources, can be very resource expensive and very tiring, but it does have the advantage that we might eventually learn something, we might strike on something. The final one of these is compulsive action, and that's just carrying on regardless. This is the keeping doing. And if we look at the countries that did just carry on regardless in the COVID crisis, you can see that they had some of the worst outcomes possible. It cost them both time and resources. They didn't learn anything, and they didn't mitigate against the downside, the exposure either. I'd briefly ask you and give you a few seconds to reflect, either in the chat or in the questions and answers thing, on what you've seen, when you've seen these three responses in the organizations you work for or in society in general. Are there any examples that you've come across? Okay, so hopefully you've kind of come up with a few, and it will go, yeah. Here, herd immunity is a great example in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, that is very much one of the things, the expectation that we could basically do stuff and it would just work itself out. Yeah, it was optimistic and yeah, proved to be slightly too optimistic. That's exactly that's a really good example of the kind of just carrying on doing what we were doing before. So yeah, I think we see these all the time. Actually, when you start to look for them, you can start to see them all the time. And I'll come back to these at the end because they're a really important thing to work through and work with and avoid happening too much. So we're going to revisit those, but for the time being, we're going to move into how we can engage when we don't do this. So with all of those as options, what else can we do? So the problem with chaos is really it's an inability to predict. We need predictive models to be able to figure out what we're going to do and what the world's going to do back at us. So a lot of our actual concepts are really about figuring out how we can act effectively, how we can act and meet our needs. And I'm going to borrow some and elaborate on some stuff from the Cynefin model, which if you've seen my talks before, I may have talked about. It's a useful model for understanding the different contexts in which we work and how to approach them. So I'm going to take you through a few of these, borrow a bit and elaborate. If you want some more follow-up, let me know at the end and we can talk about that. So the first place that we encounter in the model is chaos. And chaos is the unknown, literally the unknown. We do not know anything. We find ourselves in this chaotic space. None of the rules work. None of our models work. We just don't know what we're doing. Now, the thing about chaos is when we're talking about this, it's not really about the situation. It's actually about our relationship to the situation. Cool. Okay. So that relationship is really, it explains that it's us that has it. Chaos isn't about the situation, it's about how we relate to the situation, as are these other contexts. And the thing about chaos is it's scary, and it's scary for a good reason. It's telling us that we need to do something about it, that there's some problem there. We don't want to be in this state of limbo forever, not being able to do anything. And the first step with this is to actually deal with the fear, to face that fear and turn towards it and actually acknowledge it for what it is. And this happens to prepare us for the next step as well. This is a really kind of simple practice. And what I'd like to do is give you a very quick example of what just turning towards the situation. Hopefully this isn't a very scary situation, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what we're feeling, what we're kind of worrying about at the moment. We're just going to have a quick practice of what it feels like to turn towards the situation and get a sense of the situation instead of just being and thinking in our heads. So what I'd invite you to do is just get comfortable in your chair, move in your chair, make sure your feet are on the ground, you can feel yourself sitting up straight in the chair so you can quietly kind of pay attention. And when you've done that, when you've got to a comfortable position, you can kind of sit comfortably in for the next 30 seconds, minute or so. I'd invite you to just soften your gaze, focus away from the screen, or close your eyes entirely, and start to just feel into the sensation that you're feeling in your body, rather than the thoughts. There will be thoughts. You're listening to my voice, which will probably prompt even more. But start to feel into the sensations, just of yourself sitting, of the weight of everything, of the weight of yourself sitting in the chair, your feet on the floor, maybe your arms on an armrest. And see what sensations and thoughts start to come up when there isn't any external input. You might also want to listen to or feel the sensations of yourself breathing in and breathing out. See how that goes. Just what's there. No need to judge anything, do anything about it. Just what arises. Okay. So you can open your eyes again, relax, just go back to the back to being in this presentation and paying attention to the presentation. Be interesting to quickly reflect on whether anything changed for you, whether you feel slightly different now to when you started. But what I want to talk about is why this is such a useful thing for dealing with this situation, why this kind of technique can really help you do this. When we've got to the end of this first stage, chaos, we know we're ready to move on. When we're calmly aware of something, when it's not panicky, when we're just aware of it, it doesn't have that really strong attachment, that there's something there that we don't know what it is, we don't know what to do about it, but we're okay with that for the time being, and we're going to do something about it next. So we're now moving on to the next step of the process. the next thing that's going to help us move from this unknowing all the way through to being able to do something about it. This next step is complexity. This is the space of the uncertain. It's where we think about things as complex adaptive systems. If you've done anything in this space, it's actually the realm of people, living things, organizations, and society. It's the big messy stuff that kind of we have a sense of, but we can't really predict. And ironically, this is often the most overlooked. I suspect it's because it's so ubiquitous. We kind of assume it kind of takes care of itself. But it's actually a really important phase to get right, because when we get this area right, we can then move forward much more effectively. This space is about navigation, and we do it with the feelings and the sense of things rather than really concrete details. It's probabilistic rather than deterministic. And it's a bit unpredictable and messy. We can't really automate in this space. So it's not really a good space to create computer systems in, certainly yet. But what we can do is we move through it in a way that allows us to be really effective later on. By working well in this space, we enable what we do next to work better. So you might find that when you turn towards, when you deal with the feelings, it actually moves you towards the beginnings of knowing, understanding, getting a sense of what you can do about it. That's very often the case. This isn't an active space. It literally is. It just kind of happens. And I'm going to explore why that should be now. So we're often kind of taught to think of ourselves as this mind floating freely in a body, this kind of brain in a jar. You know, there's this kind of ghost in the machine. And we're just this brain that's separate on some way from the physical world. But it's absolutely not true. Much of our cognition is entirely embodied. We actually use our bodies to understand the world and the conceptual world as well. Our knowing comes from our embodied sense. So we can't really separate the two. Even the most abstract ideas are eventually linked to physical experience and physical things we can do, we have done and can do in the world. So we need this to understand ourselves in context and understand the world in context. And we can only do those in relation to one another. And it's this space that we're really talking about. What happens when you become aware of your body and it calms down and those sensations start to rise is you start to let this part of your brain work and begin to understand some context and build that context for you so that you can then move on to the next step. And it's when you understand it, you can then, that's what allows you to then work with it. So when we can understand this, we start to understand the relationship between things. And the relationship between what we know is really important. We talk about what we know as if it's just a big list, but it's actually the relationship between the facts, you know, how these things lead on from each other that matters at least as much as the details of the facts themselves. And this space is actually the very difficult space to work in because we can't work in it directly. It's all implicit. It's kind of slightly hidden. It's uncertain. So it's a very difficult space to work in. It's not yet explicit. And we're not trained to work in it. I've got an interesting question. Yeah. So I'm just going to read out the question as we go. So physicists and philosophers would say that under the apparent randomness of chaos, there are underlying patterns, interconnectedness, repetition. So the certainty is there, even if not accessible to the simple human. Yeah, absolutely. I agree entirely. It is discernible to us. I believe it is entirely discernible to us. And this process of discernment is really, really important. So this is an interesting stage because this is when it's moving from being kind of that complete apparent randomness to starting to take shape, starting to take form, starting to become concrete. And what's interesting for me is this is the domain of strategy. This is the domain where we define the space that we're going to work in. This is the space, this is where we figure out where is better than trial and error. Where is better than that? Just randomly trying things. Because what we're doing here is we're delineating a space to experiment in. And what we're finished here when we have a good feel for the situation. We don't necessarily know the details of what we're going to do about it, but we have a really good feel for it. We understand it on an intuitive, implicit level, even if we don't have clear path forward. The next stage is about getting that clear path. So this next space is the space of complication. This is the space of machines, mechanistic things. It's also the space of risk. And one of the things we often talk about is we conflate risk and uncertainty, but they're importantly different. So risk, and the reason this space is the risky is because it has a quantifiable range of outcomes. We know what might happen. In the uncertain, we don't know what might happen. And that's a really important difference. So we know the range of outcomes in this space. So this is closer to certainty. This is more reliable. At least we know what the range of possible outcomes are going to be, and they're deterministic. So if we put the same things in, we're going to get the same things out. And we can actually model this computationally. This is the space of computer models with the right model and enough computing power anyway, because some of these models can be very, very complex. And it's interesting. For me, I think computing has very relatively recently overtaken humans in some aspect of this space. Go, which was famously a very difficult game for computers to play, because it's very complicated, it has huge ranges of branching probabilities, has recently been kind of conquered by computers. Computers are now better than human players at playing Go. And this was considered the kind of last bastion of AI in some ways. But the thing about Go is that it has a constrained endpoint. There's still a way to win. There's one way to win. You know, there's one clear objective. And that's what this space is about, having a clear objective. The challenge of working here when you're working in this new context, though, is do you actually have a good enough model? You know, we don't have a comparator yet. So we're in kind of more familiar territory for IT now and for business in general now, but it's still not entirely standard practice, this exploring the unknown. I think agile working is often a good expression of this, and understanding that this is where agile is powerful, is when we're working in this new space. It's about testing models. It's about taking an iterative approach. It's about exploring and working through. But the space we are working is qualitative. You know, that's what we're iterating through. That's the space we're exploring in this more determined way, in this more deterministic way. It's still felt. And when we lose the feel of it, when we lose the sense of it, we tend to go off track. We start exploring, we go back into the random trial and error. And when we go back into random trial and error, we're in that space of branching possibilities. You could play chess entirely by trial and error, just by moving random pieces within the rules, but you wouldn't win that many games doing it. And it's context strategy that holds us with better than trial and error. And one of the things that's really important here is organizations that separate their development and implementation teams, whether that's IT or whether that's other development and implementation teams, from this context, from the context of their users, the business situation, the leadership and what they're looking for. They start playing this game of trial and error chess, and it's really not an effective way to play the game. So the outcome of this phase is tactics. What we have when we have tactics is a clear and concrete set of steps that we can follow. It's a recipe. We are at the end of this phase when we know what the situation is and we know what we can do about it. When we're in this phase, we can actually automate. We can do it without thinking about it, which is the essence of automation, really. And we can also pass this off to systems that can be automated. This tends to be a space where value is increasingly less important now. there's less value in the doing and more in the automating of the doing. This is why we see so many IT companies becoming multi-billion-pound organizations. So yeah, this last space is that of execution, of carrying out the steps. It's the running of the program. There's actually not much here for us to do than either do it or run it and set it up and wait for a result. But that result is important. Maybe we get an expected result, and for me, the expected result is the boring one. I mean, it's successful, it's great, but it's kind of boring. Then we move towards improving, we move towards efficiency, we move towards making the steps more reliable, more consistent, and more efficient. There's loads of stuff in this space. This is the space of most of ITIL. This is the space of Six Sigma. This is how we move things and make them more efficient. It's also largely the space of the Toyota method. And so this is the kind of, there's really valuable things, but for me, it's just personally, it's not that interesting. I'm more interested in the unexpected result. What the unexpected result does is it kicks off a reflection cycle. We have to work backwards. We go through a debugging process. We have to test our models and assumptions and the way that these are built. Now, this is a whole nother subject and a whole nother branch, and I'm not going to take us down that road for the time being. What I'm going to do is take us to the end of one cycle. But just so you know, this is where we can go once we do finish the cycle. So there are a few pitfalls as we go on this path that I'd like to reiterate, and these are related to the problems that we saw right at the beginning. The first one is that we can get stuck in fear. We can hide under the duvet. We can always, but the point is actually we can always do something. We're never without the ability to respond, at least until it doesn't matter to us anymore anyway. So being able to find a response in the situation is always going to be more effective than just reaction. It's really important to do this. But equally, this is not about blind optimism. This is not about carrying on. This is not about pretending that things aren't really difficult, aren't really a problem. It's about developing the ability to experience the good and the bad together at once. There's another problem here, which we've spoken about, which is the losing sight of context. It's about really understanding where you are sitting in the current situation. So once we've established the context, we need to stay in that context. You need to build yours and actually establish that context for yourself, develop a practice and really work with it when it's challenged. And you can contribute to that for others too. And for me, I think the most important thing for those of us who work in existing organizations is to ask for it where it's not provided and know that that's what you're asking for. It's important for your work. And where we're not provided context, either when we get a request, it can be really, really difficult to know what to do. And very often where we fail to deliver on the expectation, that's why. It's not that we failed to deliver on what we knew, it's that because we didn't know something, there was an important piece of the context missing. And the final pitfall is a really, really important one, and one that I think many organizations fall into. And if there's one bit that I'd like you to take away from this about what you can do and how you can work differently, it's this. The pitfall is confusing tactics and strategy. Many, many people, and when I say people, I would include many senior politicians in this, confuse strategy. They say strategy, and what they mean is an unactionably complicated set of tactics. They've laid out a pathway and they think we should follow it. And this is a really, really unhelpful way to work because it takes us down a blind alley. It takes us a way that we can't adapt as we go. We can't learn. And the thing about tactics is they're very, very precise. They're about precision. They're about being able to repeat something over a small space with small variation. And that's great, that's okay, as long as it's accurate. And accuracy is the ability to hit the target in the first place. It doesn't matter how reliably and efficiently you can aim in a place if you're not hitting the thing that you want to hit. And this is where it's a real problem, when what we do is we very efficiently execute failure rather than successfully, but less efficiently, being successful. And one of the really important things for us in the BCS is that computers are highly precise. They're entirely precise, but they need humans to make them accurate. They need us to be able to use them as a tool for doing something really genuinely useful. So I'm pretty confident that we will resolve the current crisis in some way or another, and we will begin thriving again. That's, I think some people would find that an optimistic position, but we've been through this kind of thing many times before as a society. These problems kind of come up over and over again. What happens though is that we can't really solve them. We never really solve them. They never really fully go away. What we do is we resolve them. We integrate them into our assumptions. We integrate them into the things that protect us automatically. So we no longer have to consciously think about them and consciously work around them. They just become part of the landscape. And there will always be new problems out there. I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where we don't have this kind of issue coming in. There's still going to be the possibility of problems arising outside of our context. We can't sit still. We can't assume that in our comfortable current situation, once we return to a more comfortable situation, that it's going to last forever. What we can do is prepare for what happens when something comes in from outside. And to do that, we push the boundaries of uncertainty. We push into this space intentionally. When things are comfortable, when we're okay, we explore. We work out from that space of being comfortable, of having what we need. This means expanding our knowledge. And when we expand our knowledge and the edges of our knowledge, it means encountering new problems before they encounter us. So we've already solved loads of problems that would have been a massive crisis, but we encountered and we figured out and we came up with a solution. And one pretty good example of this is the Y2K problem. We had this genuine major threat to a lot of automated systems and pretty much fixed it with very few problems. I think one of the challenges of working in this way is that, much with the Y2K problem, is we were so successful as a profession that the world turned around and asked us, well, why did we spend all that money addressing this problem? Because clearly it wasn't a problem. The other way to look at it is actually we successfully engaged with this, we successfully pushed this, and there are wider societal assumptions that we are challenging when we do this. So it's not straightforward necessarily to do. And the other thing that happens when we push these boundaries, when we do this, we actually build the capability, the tools, the approach that we need to engage effectively with the unknown. So when we're pushed into this space without doing it intentionally, we actually have more capability, more ability to really get to a workable situation much faster than we currently do, and to be able to deal with bigger problems on a bigger scale as well. And for me, there are some really exciting possibilities coming up in the quantum computing space around this. I think this is really where this frontier is pushing. So that's going to be something that maybe we as an IT profession can actually start exploring in a computing way, as well as in a how we're approaching our work way in the next few years. And for me, the essence of pushing these boundaries, what it means to push these boundaries, is leadership. And I know that's not leadership in exactly the way that we think about it, but this kind of leadership is a really important thing for everyone to be able to do and to develop as a capacity, because we all have a unique and valuable perspective. It's the diversity of perspective that protects us, gives us more eyes on the problem, gives us more approaches that we can take, and means that we've got more awareness, more ability to spot these things before they're problems as well. So it's a fundamentally important thing that we are all cultivating this capacity. So I want to give you a bit of a challenge, something to go away with, something to think about here. If we're all leading, yeah, how do we do that? You know, we can't all be leaders in exactly the same space. That doesn't make sense. But we are all leaders in our own space. And one way to think about this is exactly which of the domains do you lead in? Where is your unique set of awareness, things that you're really sensitive to, and things that you're really good at? Where does that fit you into the system? Where can you most usefully use that? Instead of thinking really that there's only one space that we're working in. And of course you have to work across all of these domains, we all do. But this question is about where is your strength? Where is your greatest strength? And what's interesting about particularly the first two is they're often quite unwelcome. They're not usually things that organizations think they want. So we tend to have to work with them in a slightly different way. Now, this first space, chaos, right? Who wants chaos? That's people who break stuff. That's the testers. That's the application testers. That's the amazing people who can find a flaw in any system. That's the security experts and the penetration testers as well, you know, who can find the gaps and break stuff and push into this space of chaos. The next step is complexity. And this is the space of strategists and designers. It's also the space of programmers when they specialize in working in new problems, and this space of working on an unknown problem. So what's weird about this space is you'd think, okay, that sounds really desirable. That sounds like something every organization would want. The problem with this space is that it becomes a threat to existing authority. Where we've got a model that authority needs to know best, that the manager, the CEO needs to know best. This is a huge threat because this is new knowledge. This generates new knowing. And that can be a threat if people aren't comfortable with updating their own knowledge. So there's a huge amount of stuff, social stuff to be done here. It's very much that space of integration and linking up. And it does generate new possibility. It's a very powerful space for organizations to work in. And there are some organizations that are kind of starting to work in this space, and it goes, but for me, it's the domain that there's most value in exploring at the moment. The next step is complication. The next space is complication. And that's the area of risk managers, project managers, and programmers optimizing existing problems. It's about how we improve and kind of continually improve. And it's a great space. If you're in it, brilliant, I'm very grateful. It's a common space for IT people to be in, and I think it's a common space for IT people to get stuck in, even when they're not that. The final space is clarity and the certain. I don't think this is a very interesting space for us because we tend to use computers to do it. We just tend to use computers for this. So we have very little need for this. And the kind of history of humanity really is a move away from this space, a move away from having to just kind of go and hit things with rocks, which is a very simple action, all the way through to the great, you know, the very sophisticated things that we're doing now. So we tend to move away from this space. But there is value in doing it, even if we don't lead in it. So I'd like you to reflect on exactly where you lead personally, and also think about where your organization or the organization that you run or that you'd like to run or that you work in, where does it lead? What is its domain of, where does it deliver value in these terms? And how do you relate to that? You know, because we're going to need to, even any organization, whatever domain it's in, is going to need people in all of these domains to work in all of these domains. So it gives you a really good idea of where you can deliver value. And if you feel really stuck in the current situation, the current context, it also gives you an idea of where you might more fruitfully move next. If you're in a really exploratory organization and you really like the certainty and the complication, and you want the risk management and you like that, then you're always going to find that challenging and a struggle. And if you don't enjoy that struggle, it's not a good place to be. And you probably want to find an area of work where that's more appreciated. If you go into, say, aviation or healthcare, that does need a greater degree of this reliability than, say, cutting edge, app development. So to take us through next steps after this, first step, don't panic. We've gone through a whole load of stuff and kind of brought a whole load of stuff to light. The most important thing with this is it's okay to get bits of it. It's okay to get a feel for it. The most important thing here is to turn and face what's going on. It's much more about the sense of it. It's not about remembering all of the specifics of anything in this talk or in the general situation. One really important part of this is because it's so embodied, you will benefit from listening to your body's needs, things that get you out of your head and into your body. That might mean going for a walk in nature. That might mean taking up some practices, allowing yourself to play, allowing yourself to be creative. It's actually a really important part of this work. Wherever your big domain of leadership is, allowing yourself some creativity helps that other domain get better. So have a play with that. Just allow yourself some space. It's not wasted time. It's actually really important for all of us, for our mental health and for our ability to be effective and helpful for other people. The next step is explore. It's always going to be valuable, again, to push these boundaries for yourself. And that means learning, that means playing, that means following your interest, allowing yourself to be a bit oblique, to be going off at a slightly different tangent. Because we don't fully know what's going on in this space, we don't know what's useful, you can come across some really interesting stuff and you can draw links from it. A lot of progress happens when we join different domains up. So it's a model from one domain and then you apply it to a different domain. A huge number of discoveries have actually been done on that basis. And the final one of these is figure out where you want to lead. Because when you can figure that out for yourself and help others do that, we can build more resilience and more opportunity for everyone around us, really. And by doing this collectively, that's how we protect, we play our part in dealing with the current situation and how we play our part in making the next situation better and making that better last longer too. So that's the end of my talk. Personally, so you can find out more about me on matthewbellringer.com and you can search for Mathew Bellringer on LinkedIn. There is now one other Mathew Bellringer on LinkedIn. I used to be able to say there weren't any, so there's a bit of chaos for you. But my job description is as an adaptive transformation guide, so that's me. Please do connect if you're not connected already. I'd love to have this conversation and talk more. To that end, we're also seeking to start this conversation within the BCS. So we're exploring what that might look like. So if you're a BCS member and you're interested in exploring more of this conversation, or if you'd like to become a BCS member, then please do get in touch with me and we're going to see what we can do to put something together to see if we can kind of start this conversation in the organization so that we can spread the message a bit further out through the profession and then through into the wider world. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Can everybody hear? Can you hear me, Matthew?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good, good. I've managed to find out how to work the system now. Matthew, thanks very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. Are there questions from people at all? They'll have to unmute their loudspeaker or their microphone, I mean, to ask them. But anybody got a question? I can't see who's asking a question, but just actually speak with sensitivity and don't speak over somebody else. First one, please. Well, I'm going to ask Matthew the first one myself then. Have you talked to people who've tried this sort of technique outside the IT world, Matthew? because as some of you know, I'm operating very much outside the IT world now, other than involved with this sort of thing. And very much I can see such relevance of it in that sort of situation as well.
Yes, I think what's interesting is to some degree this is a set of ideas from outside the IT world. This is the space that many people who work with complex adaptive systems that feel like they have a life of their own or do have a genuine life of their own, have come to themselves as a practice. So that is actually, you know, a lot of these ideas are informed by the psychology space. So as practitioners, quite a lot of these people are therapists and coaches and people doing this work. Also, founders and entrepreneurs are often working in this space when they're doing disruptive, this edge pushing work as well. So this is really about how we, on some level, you know, from a BCS perspective, what I'm interested in doing is helping IT as a profession support this work in a more effective way, knowing that it can be done and helping push it forward, and also making a case for the value of working in these new spaces within IT organizations, because I think that's one of the other big parts of it. So it's a two-way thing for me. It's about this cross-fertilization of ideas, and because I work in this space, this kind of between space as well, and on some degree I'm sharing these ideas from this other world with the IT profession, and I'm actually sharing the ideas around agile, which are really, really good for testing and iterating, with this other world. So it's a really interesting, you know, this cross-fertilization is a really important thing. But yeah, so for me, it's about how we move this forward together, ultimately.
Thank you, Matthew. Some questions, please, and do just unmute your mics. You should be able to do it, hopefully.
Or do use the question box. I can.
Yes, use the question box.
So
Matthew,
thank you.
I can't see it. I've got sufficient up.
I can see a raised hand. I don't know what to do with that though.
Well, let's learn by trial and error. Suggest the person unmutes their microphone and ask their question. Or types their question into the message area. Then Matthew can see that.
So I'm seeing here.
We're all learning on the job tonight, I'll tell you. Is that you, Blaise, saying that you can answer but can't put in questions?
I think Blaise, yeah, the IT would be good if they ever get it to work. Yes, this is exactly it. It's the problem is defining what it is, and what to work means. It's a very difficult challenge. Okay, yeah, I think there seems to be some
probably
limitation.
got all the questions. If there aren't any more questions, I would really encourage you, please do contact Matthew, because you know it is the new ways of approaching things and dealing with the complexities and managing to get through them all and come out with a viable solution and actually operate in what is a fast changing, as it always has been and always will be, profession. But Matthew, I really want to thank you very much for persevering despite the technology challenges at the beginning. And thank you everybody for joining us. One thing I do get on my screen is the number of attendees. So we've actually had 22 people this evening, which is very encouraging as a first trial. That's excellent.
That's very good for a first. So thank you all for staying, for listening, and thank you all for staying with us despite the technical hiccups at the beginning and the slightly uninteractive nature of things. I'm not. I think we'll take this experience away and explore whether this is the right platform going forward, or whether we'll use something else.
I think we're back to Zoom. Unfortunately, I haven't got the details yet, but there will be a meeting on our normal Wednesday of the month at 7:30 next month, and our plan is to do a Zoom meeting each and every month and see how it goes.
So, yes, to answer one of the quick questions, can we get a copy of the slides? The answer is you'd be welcome to a copy of the slides. I don't have a download link, so connect with me on LinkedIn and drop me a message and I'll send you them.
Thank you, Matthew.
Lovely stuff. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the evening then.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.
Good
Bye.
night.
Good night.